If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. You didn't come here for answers. Maybe not even for sleep. Maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push. They float, like loose threads in an old tapestry, waiting for a finger to follow. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe. Only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that don't remember how they got here. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. It began with the name, not hers, but her father's, or her grandfather's. Maybe even some distant uncle who once knelt beside a bleeding king and caught his dying breath, or claimed he did. You're not remembered for what you are. You're weighed by who stood behind you in the records, and how quietly you carried them on your back. No one asked if she was kind, or thoughtful, or if she laughed like cracked bells in the morning. That wasn't the currency. In medieval history, the worth of a woman, at least one destined to marry up, or sideways, was counted in lineage, not in love. Imagine a girl sitting at a long, dark table. Candles flicker, casting shadows too large for her frame. Around her, men mutter about bloodlines and alliances, while a servant quietly pours watered wine. Her name is spoken once and then discussed as if she isn't there at all, because to them, she isn't. Not yet. Not really. She's a suggestion, a contract, a branch that may bear fruit, or rot politely if need be. They'll want to know where her mother came from, whether there was madness in her grandmother's line, whether her great-uncle's second wife died in childbirth, and if so, how many times. That's the irony. These men believed in divine right, and still made their marriages like merchants. She may be lovely, but beauty fades, or worse, betrays. A lovely woman may tempt others, or herself. A lovely woman might know her power. A lovely woman could cause war. Better plain than perilous. Better modest than mesmerizing. Better still if she looks like her father's coat of arms. Even her body was part of the heraldry. Pale skin meant she hadn't worked in fields. Slender hands meant embroidery, not bread. Even her posture was a reference upright, still, unmoving, like scripture, like stone. They said a good woman should be seen rarely, heard less, and remembered always. The trick was becoming a ghost before you were ever fully real. And for noble families, there were rankings not just of people, but of virtue. The most desirable girl was one who brought no scandal, no debt, and no opinions. Her value was in how little damage she could do simply by existing. There's a kind of cruelty that hides inside politeness, and nowhere did it shimmer more than in the eyes of noblemen assessing their daughter's worth. She wasn't presented. She was appraised. It didn't matter what she believed, or if she had dreams that unfolded like morning robes. Those were never requested, not even once. They would ask if she could sing, but not too well. A girl who sang like a siren could be dangerous, just enough grace to charm the guests, not enough to make anyone stare too long. They would ask if she could read, but again, not too much. A girl who read could write. A girl who wrote could remember, and remembered things often had edges. In the end, she had to become something like parchment white, blank, and ready to be signed upon. Even the church had its opinions. Not officially, perhaps, but in whispers. A woman of noble breeding must know her place and ideally not feel it. She must bow, not break, smile, not speak. There's something haunting about a girl who was raised not to live, but to be given. And if she was lucky, though, luck here is a matter of perspective, she might be sent to a convent as a child, trained in piety, silence, and how to pour wine without letting the rim drip. There, among the cold stone and candlelight, she would learn how to walk quietly, how to eat without making sound, how to fold her hands like wings, as if she never had claws. Some learned it too well, some never unlearned it. The truth is, even her emotions were considered part of her breeding. A girl who cried easily was deemed unstable. A girl who didn't cry at all, possibly dangerous. A future schemer. You see how it goes, damned for too much, dismissed for too little. She walked a narrow hall with no doors, only expectation. And as her wedding drew near, no one asked what she thought of the man. They'd already confirmed what mattered: his land, his title, his usefulness. Her feelings would be assumed to match the arrangement. After all, wasn't she lucky? Sometimes luck sounds like footsteps you didn't choose to follow. There were exceptions, of course. Always. A few women spoke. A few were loved. A few carved out lives that were their own in ink, in stone, in scandal. But these were not the rules. These were the accidents. For most, their stories were told in the margins, or not at all. She might be remembered if her son became king, or if she died beautifully, draped in loyalty and linen. Otherwise, she would fade like the soft corners of a well-thumbed book, still part of the whole, but unspoken. Some nights aren't long. They're just wide like a field no one crossed. You wonder what she thought. The night before she was sent away, did she pray? Did she braid her hair one last time and pretend it mattered? Did she press her face against the cold stone and imagine herself into someone braver? Or maybe she just went still, like a candle choosing not to fight the wind. They never asked what she wanted, and if they did, it was only in jest, like one might ask the weather what it prefers, sun or snow. Everyone already knew the answer that mattered, not her desires, not her temperament, not even her dreams, only her dowry. The number was decided before she ever stepped into the room, before she bled for the first time, sometimes, before she spoke her first full sentence. It was written into accounts, penciled beside debts, weighed like iron on a ledger someone else would carry to the altar. In medieval history, love came after the coins, if it came at all. The marriage was not a union of hearts, but of houses, a consolidation of power, a trade, a bet placed by families whose futures were too fragile to rest on the whims of affection. Land was too scarce, bloodlines too valuable, alliances too precarious. You were not a girl. You were the balance to a negotiation. She might bring cattle, a vineyard, 3 silver goblets, and a promise that her father would forgive a loan. That was enough for a minor baron with debts. Another girl might bring silk sheets from Genoa, a half-dozen servants, and a stained glass window paid in advance for a future chapel. That could lift a small family toward nobility, if only for a generation. Even the church knew to stay quiet during these transactions. They called marriage a holy sacrament, but understood that holiness could be brokered for the right price. And if her dowry was too small, then love, if she was foolish enough to hope for it, would need to be patient, very patient, because she'd likely remain in her father's home long past the age considered proper. Suitors would pass her by for younger, richer girls. Eventually, a widower with 6 children and an aching knee might inquire not because she was radiant, but because her expectations had likely dimmed with time. There's a slow erosion that happens when your worth is discussed like livestock, even if the room smells of wine and candle wax. The quiet cruelty was how little these girls understood about what was being bartered. Many were raised knowing they were assets, but still held onto the soft spaces inside themselves, the places where they tucked away stories, imagined glances, small hopes. The tender wish that maybe, just maybe, someone might want them for something else. A laugh, a look, the way they once helped a robin trapped in the dovecote. But doves didn't count for much, not compared to goats. And in some cases, the negotiations dragged on for months, letters back and forth between fathers, uncles, lawyers, monks. Entire villages waited on the outcome. A favorable match could mean lowered taxes or safer roads. An unfavorable one could doom a generation. A girl became geography. Her dowry might decide whether her future husband sent men to war or stayed neutral, whether two rivers would be connected by marriage and thus by trade, or whether a noble house could build a second tower and pretend it had always been that tall. And in those quiet corners where the girl sat, hands folded, voice hushed, waiting, no one ever explained what came next. No one warned her that her dowry did not end with the coins. It continued through her body. She must give sons, not just one. One could die. Two might fight. Three would ensure a legacy. And so her dowry became her duty to carry on the bloodline she'd been purchased into. Some tried to fight, quietly, of course. A girl might ask questions, even in whispers. But too many questions made a man nervous. Better she learn her place, not through force, but through omission, through silences so large they echoed louder than sermons. And then came the garments, the wedding gown, white or red or gold depending on local custom, stitched with borrowed wealth, pearls sewn along the hem, coins hidden in the sleeves, lace imported through too many hands to name. The dress wasn't for her. It was a signal, a declaration of value like a beautifully wrapped ledger. When she walked down the aisle, her feet barely touched the floor, not from grace, but because she was already disappearing, becoming not a person, but a possession wrapped in ceremony. You imagine the moment just before the vows. A hush falls, not reverence, but calculation. This is the pause where the trade finalizes, where families become in-laws, and land changes hands invisibly. Her hands are trembling not from nerves, but from knowing the ink is dry. It was less a wedding than a transfer of weight. And yet, somehow, the pressure still landed on her shoulders. If the marriage failed, if the husband strayed, if children didn't come, if the manor burned, whispers might suggest her dowry had been cursed, or worse, insufficient. No one blamed the coin. They blamed the woman it traveled with. Even the servants, who carried none of the power, learned to measure their lady by what she brought into the house. She came with candles and little else, they might say, or her father gave too much, and so now he controls the bread. Some nights, the woman herself believed it. You wonder how many brides sat awake their first night, staring at carved beams above their marriage bed, wondering what exactly had been bought and whether they'd ever own anything again. There's a stillness in these kinds of transactions, a silence not born from peace, but from resignation. Historians still debate whether dowries were a form of economic protection, a way to ensure women held some measure of leverage, or simply another layer of control, a golden leash tied in silk. Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe it was just what was done. What wasn't done was asking the girl how she felt. And sometimes, that lack of asking lingered for decades. Through every childbirth, every supper served in silence, every festival danced through with aching feet, Every year her hair thinned, her laughter dimmed, her dowry long spent but never forgotten. Maybe the hardest part wasn't that she was bought. Maybe it was that she wasn't even considered expensive. A rhetorical question drifts. Was there ever a time when she thought the coins meant she mattered? They told her not to stare, not in anger, not in curiosity, not even in stillness. A woman's gaze, in noble circles of medieval history, was a thing to be managed like her voice, her footsteps, her breath. If her eyes wandered too freely, they were said to wander somewhere else as well. And if she held another's eyes too long, it was either arrogance or temptation, possibly both. So she looked down, or to the side, or at the embroidery in her lap, and when someone spoke to her, she answered with her head slightly bowed, her lips measured like scales that had to be recalibrated daily, because the truth was simple and silent women who looked back were rarely chosen. A girl raised for marriage understood early that her vision, the literal direction of her eyes, could alter her future. A glance held too long could unravel an engagement. A flicker of amusement, if poorly timed, might be read as mockery. A look of grief might be seen as complaint. And complaint, in a wife, was not a trait, but a flaw. Even beauty had to be careful. A beautiful woman with a soft gaze was prized. A beautiful woman with an alert, attentive stare. She became unsettling, too aware, too present, too dangerous. You wonder what that did to a child. To be taught that seeing that the simple act of observing the world honestly might cost her the very future she'd been sculpted for. It wasn't blindness they wanted, just obedience that started in the pupils. There were girls who learned the art quickly, who studied how to look without being seen, who trained themselves to let their lashes veil their attention, who practiced softness like a soldier practices their salute exact, rehearsed, and without deviation. It wasn't deception, it was survival. And in the tapestries, in the paintings, in the illuminated manuscripts, commissioned by wealthy lords to celebrate their wives, her eyes were always cast downward or to the side, never meeting the viewer. She is gentle, she is humble, she is good. But beneath the ink, beneath the threads, you have to wonder, did the artist ever feel her watching him back? There's an old poem, tucked in the margin of a 13th century sermon, that speaks of a woman who looked at a knight in the wrong way at the wrong hour. The sermon does not name her. It does not say what happened next, but the verse lingers. Her gaze caught the moonlight and held it too long. That was all, as if that alone explained everything. And perhaps it did. The ideal bride did not interrogate the world with her eyes. She accepted it. She smiled at the right moment, never too wide. She blinked in agreement, never in surprise. She scanned the floor before she moved, so she would not appear hesitant when she crossed a room. Even her pace was rehearsed, synced to a gaze that never asked for answers. Because questions could lead to thoughts, and thoughts led to opinions, and opinions, in a woman, could be mistaken for intention. But some girls couldn't help it. Some looked, not out of boldness, but because the world was too alive not to. A bird darted past the window, and her eyes followed it. A young boy stumbled, and she winced in sympathy. A knight complimented her hair, and she looked to see if it was true. These weren't crimes, but they were noted. Mothers whispered corrections afterward. Fathers scowled without words. Aunts mentioned, over meals, how still their own eyes had been, how silent their glances, how grateful their husbands. Sometimes the girls adjusted, sometimes they didn't. And when a girl met a man's eyes, particularly a suitor, or worse, one not meant to be hers, the air thickened. The moment became sharp, like wool stretched too tight on a loom. She might have meant nothing. He might have meant nothing. But the room wouldn't forget. Neither would the priest. Neither would the grandmother watching with fingers clenched around a rosary. There was something dangerous about a woman who could make a man pause without speaking, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't need to say. Historians often speak about power as land, or title, or wealth. But in medieval history, the most subversive power a woman could hold was attention she hadn't asked for, and the most feared women were the ones who seemed to understand they had it. And yet, what if the girl wasn't powerful? What if she was just curious? Curious about the texture of his gloves, curious about how he walked with a limp, even though he smiled as if he didn't notice. Curious about why he never seemed to eat the bread, only the broth. What if her gaze was not seductive, but searching? The world rarely made space for that kind of wondering. It assumed too much, interpreted too fast, and punished too quietly. You can picture her in a courtyard, watching the shadows fall against the stone. Someone speaks to her, and she forgets to look down. For just a moment, she meets their eyes full of thought, not flirtation. And later, her mother scolds her gently, eyes forward, never back. Because looking back meant something else entirely. Looking back suggested resistance, remembering, regret. Looking back made men uncomfortable because it suggested that something had been left behind, a promise, a truth, a voice. And so girls were trained to look ahead, but not too far, to focus on the tasks in front of them, to see only the floor or the embroidery hoop, to notice when the bread was overbaked or when the guest list changed, but never to ask why. Their vision was to serve, not to question. And for those who couldn't abide by it, who stared too long or too directly, there were consequences. Not always dramatic. Sometimes just a name removed from a guest list, a suitor who never returned, a marriage that dissolved before it began, sometimes a life left waiting longer than it should have. Silence, in this case, did not fall like a punishment. It fell like a shadow, slow, unspoken, unarguable. There's a phrase scratched faintly into the wooden wall of a ruined abbey in Kent. She saw too much and so remained. No signature, no date, just that, a woman, perhaps, whose gaze lingered once too often, and whose future remained suspended because of it. Meta thought drifts in quietly. Some things stay not because they're important, but because no one asked them to leave. She learned eventually, they all did, how to soften the eyes, how to watch without seeming to, how to feel things and not let them cross the face, how to see everything and say nothing. But sometimes, when no one else was looking, they turned their faces to the sky, let the sun warm their cheeks, their eyelids, their lips, just to remember they had eyes at all. Because the most dangerous kind of vision was not the one that pierced others, but the one that reminded you of yourself. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. The first thing they noticed wasn't always the face. Faces were fleeting, changeable, sometimes misread. A flush could betray nervousness. A shadow beneath the eyes could be mistaken for illness. But the hands, they told a story that couldn't be easily hidden. And in the quiet, calculated world of medieval history, a woman's hands often said more than her lips ever could. They were examined like parchment, gently, but thoroughly. A suitor's mother might take a girl's fingers in hers under the guise of affection and trace the curve of her palm as if reading the future. Was the skin soft enough to prove refinement, but not so unworked as to suggest idleness? Did the nails show care, but not vanity? Was there a faint scent of lavender from soap, or the more telling trace of onions and hearth ash? In this world, usefulness was a virtue. but too much of it made a girl suspect. A woman whose hands bore the signs of hard work might be praised in a village, but she would not be married into nobility, not willingly. The perfect bride's hands were to be like wax before it's molded clean, pliant, unshaped by anything inconvenient. It was never about laziness. It was about symbolism. Rough palms suggested a life lived too close to need. Calluses were history, written without permission. They meant she had served something other than her future husband, maybe her father's estate, maybe her younger siblings, maybe just survival itself. And that kind of history didn't marry well. So girls were trained gently at first, then relentlessly to keep their hands folded, to let others stir the pot, to avoid sun, even when the breeze outside was inviting. The hands that did too much began to thicken in the knuckles, to darken under the nails, to drift away from the image of what was considered pure. You see her now, don't you? Sitting at the edge of a stone bench in the garden, sleeves pulled low, resting her hands in her lap as if afraid they might speak. A few freckles betray time spent in sunlight, but her fingers betray nothing. They have been trained in silence. Needlework was allowed, even encouraged. It proved diligence, attention, and most importantly, it was work that left no lasting mark. If her fingertips bled from too tight stitches, no one would know, and she would never mention it. Bread making, however, was trickier. Some young ladies were taught the steps more as a novelty than a necessity. Rolling dough was acceptable, so long as it didn't toughen the heel of the hand. Anything involving firewood, stone grinding, or plucking poultry was delegated. Those belonged to another class of women entirely. Even in prayer, hands mattered. A properly clasped hand in the chapel, resting just so on the knee, became part of her reputation. It was as though each joint could betray a lack of grace. One crooked knuckle, one bitten nail, and someone might whisper that she had been too much among the kitchen maids. And yet, the contradictions sat plainly in the expectations. A noble wife must know how to manage a household, but never look as though she had to. She must prepare for childbirth and nursing, but her hands must remain untouched by anything that resembled mess. She must be ready to receive guests, organize linens, ensure the kitchen ran smoothly, all without looking like she'd ever handled the soap herself. To rule without touching, that was the ideal. A girl's posture was taught from the wrists out. She might be instructed to carry a book, not to read, but to learn the elegance of holding something delicately. A pear was another favorite object, not eaten, but balanced, passed, admired. Some even trained with glass orbs, fragile things meant to teach stillness. If it slipped, if it broke, that was not the orb's fault. In stories passed down from older girls, there were warnings. A cousin who bruised her wrist climbing the garden wall too roughly. A sister who burned her fingers while lighting candles alone. A friend whose skin, once clear, blistered from harsh soap used during a bout of illness in the manor. None of them married well. Hands were proof of lineage, of station, of promise. And promise was everything. Sometimes, these girls would dream of doing more, of clutching the reins of a horse, galloping far from obligation, of helping a wounded hawk, its wing twisted like a folded letter, of digging in warm earth, pulling weeds from around a tomato vine, letting dirt settle into their nails. But the dreams faded by morning, and their hands remained still, waiting for rings they weren't allowed to choose. There was something cruel about how stillness became the test of value. And then came the rings. When the match was settled and the church prepared, a girl would receive her first token often, a braided band of silver or iron. Simple at first, it wasn't the value that mattered. It was the symbolism. A hand taken, a hand promised, And once married, her hands were expected to change, but only in purpose. No longer a possession waiting to be claimed, now a tool of dignity, of grace, of restraint. She would touch her husband's arm at feasts, never clinging. She would discipline children with gestures, not force. She would press her fingers against her lips in contemplation, always suggesting thoughtfulness, but never dissent. But sometimes, even in the dim corners of a chamber or the silent hush of an empty garden, a woman might stretch her hands into the light. Look at them. Remember that once they knew how to bleed. There's a diary fragment from the late 1300s, preserved only in part, written by a noblewoman unnamed in the margins. One line reads, "I dreamed last night I was a potter's wife, and my fingers, at last, made something." Historians still debate what that line meant, whether it was longing, shame, or merely fantasy. Some argue it was a metaphor. Others believe she may have envied the clarity of a simpler life. But the words remain, fragile and haunting. The metaphor is sharp. Even now, hands that never touched anything real cannot know what they're missing until the day they do. The tragedy wasn't just that they were told not to touch. It was that they were told not to want to. And in every portrait, in every sculpture, in every carved relief above a tomb, the hands are always folded, fingers curved gently inward, like petals closing for the night. But petals forget they came from soil. There was a quiet cruelty in the way her body was discussed before she had even grown into it, not with vulgarity, not with lust, but with cold intention. Her hips were observed like architecture. Her breath, when she climbed a staircase, was noted as a sign of endurance. The shape of her shoulders, the thickness of her hair, the curve of her calves beneath the hem of her gown, all were considered not as parts of a person, but as clues to what she might carry. In medieval history, a woman's value didn't rest in what she had done, but in what she might produce. And what she was expected to produce from the moment her body began to change was sons. Not children, not joy, not a life shared, sons. It was spoken around her at first. The midwife might make a quiet remark after pressing her palm gently against the girl's belly. "Good hips," she'd murmur, nodding toward the mother with a knowing look. An aunt might comment on how early her cycle came, just like her grandmother, they'd say, as if the moon had already chosen her future. The priest would offer blessings during Mass for her fruitful path, a phrase that sounded holy but echoed like ownership. None of this was considered impolite. It was practical, expected, the way a farmer speaks of the rain before planting. She was a promise, not yet opened. And as the days passed, that promise began to weigh heavier. Every choice became a preparation for that future. She was given tonics to regulate her blood, herbs to ease her monthly pain, warm baths to strengthen her womb, not for her comfort, but to protect the invisible heir she might one day carry. Even when she slept, the mattress was evaluated. Too soft, and it might harm her posture. Too firm, and it could strain her back. Her body was not hers. It was a vessel being readied. And the worst part, she knew. She may not have had the words for it, may not have been able to name the feeling, but it lived inside her, that tension. That weightless panic that came not from fear, but from being expected to become something without ever being asked. You wonder what it felt like the first time she bled, not just the physical sensation, but the shift in how the world looked at her. The way her mother's face changed, not in fear, but in relief. The whispered instructions, the sudden silence from her brothers. The new responsibilities wrapped not in duty, but in hush. The way even the maidservants began to speak to her with a softened tone, no longer calling her child, but not quite woman either, as if something had happened that could never be reversed. The first blood was not a secret, it was a milestone. There are records from noble households where girls were weighed and measured in the weeks after their first bleeding, their pulses recorded, their cheeks checked for color, their sleep patterns noted in ledgers. These documents didn't speak of their dreams or fears, just of their readiness, as if the body could be coaxed into prophecy. And once a girl was deemed ready, once her womb was thought strong, stable, and sanctified, the discussions began in earnest. Her father might begin to inquire more urgently about suitable matches. Her mother might prepare dowry inventories with renewed speed. Priests would offer more targeted blessings. Her childhood was over, and she had barely spoken a word of it. It's easy to think of marriage as the turning point, but for many girls, that moment came years earlier when their bodies became symbols of fertility rather than innocence. From then on, every decision was shaped around the hope that they would birth not just life, but legacy. And failure was not an option. If she could not conceive, or worse, if she bore only daughters, her worth dissolved quietly. No one shouted, no one accused her directly, but the air changed. Her husband might become distant, her in-laws might grow sharper, meals would feel colder. Even the servants' footsteps seemed louder in the halls. Some women tried to fix it through prayer, through herbal remedies, through superstition. There were whispered recipes involving honey, cloves, milk steeped with bone, candles lit in secret, vows made barefoot on chapel floors. They blamed the stars, the weather, the sins of an unknown ancestor, anything but themselves. But blame always circled back, even when logic said otherwise, even when it was known silently, scientifically, that a man could be barren, that illness or fate or chance had a hand. Still, the burden curled into the woman's chest and stayed there, because she had one task, one reason for being chosen. And if that reason withered, some tried again and again. Even as their bodies broke down, the bones of their pelvis shifted with each birth. Their teeth loosened, their hair thinned. Each child carved something out of them, and if the child lived, it was called success. If not, she was told to try again. There is an old superstition from the Low Countries that speaks of a woman who bore 5 sons and lost them all. They say she slept for 7 nights in the church crypt, hoping to trade her breath for theirs. She died on the 8th, and the church declared her body incorrupt, not because of sainthood, but because it never truly belonged to her. It's hard to say how many women felt that truth humming beneath their skin, that they were honored not for who they were, but for what they could produce. Some found pride in it, a strange, solemn pride. They embraced the role, shaped it into something like meaning. They held their swelling bellies like lanterns, guiding families through uncertain winters. They braided their children's hair with the steadiness of someone who knew their legacy would not be written in ink, but in bloodline. Others grew quiet, not bitter, not loud, just still. They carried the weight and said little, and sometimes, at night, after the hearth dimmed and the house fell silent, they would place a hand gently over their abdomen and wonder whether anything would grow again. And then there were those who could not conceive at all. They became shadows in their own homes, useful, perhaps, for keeping the linens straight, or instructing servants, or smiling at guests, but no longer necessary. They were the tree that bore no fruit, beautiful in form, but not invited to the orchard. Historians still debate whether this relentless focus on fertility was born purely from patriarchy, or whether it was a desperate answer to high infant mortality, constant war, and uncertain inheritance. Perhaps it was all of it, or perhaps it was just the easiest way to explain away a woman's entire being. She had a womb, and so she must use it. Anything less was seen as waste. But she wasn't waste. Not even close. She was weather, always shifting. She was soil, dark and deep. She was wind in a hallway no one entered anymore. She was more than what she carried, even if no one ever told her that. And when she prayed, she didn't ask for sons. She asked to survive. There were voices a girl was never meant to hear, and yet they seemed to linger everywhere, tucked in the corners of kitchens, behind chapel curtains, beside beds where women had either groaned or bled or both. These were not loud voices. They did not shout orders, nor chant from pulpits, nor ring like bells through stone halls. These were murmurs, private exchanges, half-thoughts given shape and passed like folded linen between women who knew what the men refused to learn. In the quiet system of medieval history, knowledge passed through hands before it passed through books, especially knowledge about women. The midwife's presence was both ordinary and sacred. She might have no formal title, no seal of approval, no signature in any noble ledger, and yet her word could determine whether a match proceeded, whether a pregnancy was viable, or whether a woman's body was still considered worthy of the hopes placed upon it. She sat in doorways with a damp cloth over her knees, called for at all hours, and always knew more than she admitted. It wasn't unusual for her to be summoned not for birth, but for assessment. A girl nearing marriage age might be asked to bathe, stand, walk, even squat. While the midwife observed, she did not always touch. Sometimes it was just the look in her eyes, a narrowing of lids, a pause in breath that told everyone what they needed to hear. A single nod could carry a girl's fate forward, like a prayer whispered too clearly. Of course, the men never acknowledged these moments. They asked for confirmation and received it in vague, sanitized language. She appears healthy, strong-blooded, no signs of inherited frailty. Behind those words were things the men didn't want spelled out: the regularity of her cycle, the width of her hips, the scent of her skin at rest. Women read bodies like maps. Men just wanted directions. And the girls, they stood silent through it all, not because they didn't care, but because to object was to disrupt something older than their names. Sometimes, a midwife would speak directly to the girl, usually when no one else was listening. You breathe shallow. Try lavender under the pillow. Or, if your back aches before your time, soak your feet in cooled ash. Advice disguised as comfort. Care disguised as ritual. But there were deeper things shared. 2 warnings. Stories. Small shields against the weight of what was expected. If you bleed too long, don't say a word. Boil nettles in wine and wait. If he doesn't look at you during the act, it's not your fault. Close your eyes and picture bread rising. That helps. If the child doesn't move after 5 moons, say nothing until the 6th. Some things take longer to become. These were not instructions found in texts. They were wisdom held in marrow, passed from one woman's mouth to another's ears, kept safe by the silence men mistook for ignorance. And it wasn't only about the body. The midwife saw more than bruises. She saw how a girl flinched when her husband entered the room. She noticed when a woman who'd just given birth looked not at her baby, but at the window. She remembered who bled in spring and who cried in winter. She knew which girls had been promised too early, which ones had been promised too often, and which ones would not survive a second son. There's a record fragmentary, but preserved, of a midwife in Rouen who attended over 200 births and buried half of them. She carved a line into her wooden wall for each one, a notch upward for the living, a notch downward for the gone. At the end of her life, the wall slanted to the right, heavy with absence. She was never canonized, never mentioned in noble family trees, but every woman in her parish remembered her name longer than they remembered their husband's face. You begin to understand that this was its own kind of power. The midwife was not rich. She often had little more than herbs, a basin, and 2 hands that could move quickly even when the room filled with screams. But what she offered was trust, and in a world where a woman's body was more watched than understood, trust was currency of the rarest kind. Still, even she had limits. There were things even midwives couldn't prevent: complications from poorly spaced births, fevers after delivery, tearing that never healed. And when these things happened, blame circled quickly. Sometimes the woman, sometimes the midwife, rarely the system that forced both into places too small for their survival. There's a particularly cold phrase that appears in a nobleman's letter from 1382. She failed her purpose, and the midwife has been dismissed. Nothing more, no names, just failure. Failure, in that context, could mean anything from barrenness to bearing a girl, or worse, surviving when the child did not, because a woman's survival, without proof of fertility, was often treated as an error in arithmetic, one that required correction. And yet, the women continued. The midwives kept showing up. They brought poultices and prayers. They measured breath and pulse and grief. They whispered to girls who weren't ready and to widows who had no choice. They stitched torn flesh and shushed confused babies, and waited outside bedrooms where pleasure was never guaranteed. They understood that survival wasn't just a matter of luck. It was a matter of having someone who knew where to press, when to listen, and when to lie. Historians debate the medical accuracy of medieval midwives, whether their herb lore helped or harmed, whether their instincts were enough. But that misses the point. What they offered was not just healing, it was presence. When the world went silent around a woman's pain, the midwife did not flinch. And in return, the women told her the truth, even if they told no one else, even if their husbands heard nothing but soft smiles and colder touches. The midwife heard what no man ever did: regret, resentment, resistance. If he comes back drunk again, I won't open the door. I thought I'd love him, but I only love the way he leaves me alone. I prayed the baby would be quiet so I could sleep. Does that make me a monster? The midwife never answered directly. She didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough. And sometimes, she left something behind: a folded cloth soaked in sage, a charm made of dried orange peel and thread, a prayer written phonetically for the girl to mouth after midnight. These weren't spells. They were reminders that someone had heard her, that she wasn't entirely alone inside her body, that even if the rest of the house saw her only as function, the midwife had seen her as person. Even today, we don't know most of their names. Their records were burned, rewritten, misfiled under servant or hag or irrelevant. But their fingerprints remain in the way women learned to hold each other's hands during grief, in the way they still whisper secrets about the body when the world turns too loud. Because once, long ago, in a corner, lit only by the flame of survival, a woman knelt beside another and said, "You are more than what they need from you." And the girl believed her, even if only for a moment. She never knew when the watching began. Maybe it was the moment her dress stopped reaching her ankles and started grazing them more carefully, or when her laughter, once bright and careless, suddenly echoed too loudly through stone halls and drew unwanted glances. What she did understand, almost before she understood anything else, was that her chastity, not her character, not her kindness, not even her cleverness, was the measure by which everything else in her life would rise or fall. In the silent economy of medieval history, virtue was not a virtue unless it could be verified, and verification was not about belief, it was about control. They spoke of chastity as if it were a garment, something she wore, something that could be inspected, preserved, or in the worst cases, stained beyond redemption. It was imagined as white, as weightless, as something she carried with her, like a veil or a ribbon. But in reality, it was heavier than bone and stitched into everything she touched. To be chaste wasn't merely about abstaining. It meant being above suspicion. A girl could do nothing wrong and still lose her worth with a rumor, a glance, a misplaced laugh. Her entire value as a bride could evaporate because someone else decided to speak out of turn. And if the rumor spread, it did not matter whether it was true. Innocence, once questioned, could not be restored, only hidden. That's what made it so terrifying. Not just that her body was watched, but that her soul could be judged based on what others claimed to see in the tilt of her chin or the echo of her footsteps. So she learned early not to walk too fast that suggested recklessness, not too slow that implied seduction. She timed her breath in conversation, ensuring it never caught when speaking to men. She practiced keeping her hands visible when addressing elders. She avoided the shade of the courtyard tree where lovers supposedly met at dusk, not because she intended to do anything forbidden, but because someone else might say she had. The threat didn't come with warning. It came with whispers. An older girl shunned from the embroidery table, a cousin whose engagement was abruptly broken without explanation, a servant dismissed after someone found her outside past curfew, weeping near the well. Nothing needed to be proven. Accusation was conviction enough. And so, chastity became performance. Not a private truth, but a public one. Something demonstrated in every gesture, every syllable. Modesty became a second skin, not for her comfort, but for others' reassurance. If she wore too many ribbons, it might suggest vanity. If her gown clung too closely to her waist, someone might call her prideful. If she smiled too freely, someone else might wonder why. Even within the safety of her home, she was not entirely safe. Brothers teased, fathers warned, uncles chuckled with unease. Female relatives gave instruction with eyes that had already seen too many girls fail this quiet, impossible test. Sometimes, another woman would help her, an aunt, perhaps, someone who understood that dignity wasn't innate, but rehearsed. Keep your voice low, even when laughing. Never bend at the waist in public. Pray aloud, but softly. And never in Latin you do not understand. It sounds like pretense. These weren't suggestions. They were the threads that kept her reputation from unraveling. There is a recorded case in York from 1271 of a noble woman who was falsely accused by a rival family. The claim was simple, that she had met a young squire near the Dovecote twice in the same week. There were no witnesses, no confession, yet her betrothal was broken. The record ends with a chilling line from the family steward. The stain could not be removed, and so the cloth was not worn. She had done nothing, but she had not been believed. That was enough, because chastity was less a matter of truth than of perception, and the tools used to enforce it were varied. Physical chastity belts existed, though they were rare and mostly symbolic. More common were the social mechanisms, constant supervision, the withholding of education, the pairing of girls with older, safer companions. Some families even employed older widows, whose sole task was to accompany young women on walks or ensure their curtains were drawn before dark. But even with all that, no system was perfect, and so fear remained like dust in the seams of a dress worn too long. There were moments when a girl forgot, not out of rebellion, but because the body sometimes remembers itself. A stolen look across the feast table, a dream that lingered too long into morning, a line of poetry read once and then again, because the words made her heart ache in unfamiliar ways. These moments weren't sins, but they felt like precursors. And that fear, that anticipation of judgment, twisted her into silence. Even when a girl was harmed, truly harmed, against her will, without consent or understanding, it was still her chastity that came under scrutiny. Did she fight back? Did she scream? Why was she alone? Why was her hair unbraided, as if a violation of her body was proof that she had already violated herself? That is the most brutal irony of it all. A girl who lost her chastity by force was often treated no differently than one who had given it away, because the outcome was the same a future in question. A marriage jeopardized, a name no longer worth its dowry. So what was she to do? She learned to become invisible, or rather, to become the version of visible that invited no suspicion. She smiled without smiling. She listened more than she spoke. She bowed at the exact angle expected of her. She passed through her days like a flicker of candlelight present, but never bold enough to draw notice. And perhaps the cruelest part was this: even if she succeeded, even if she married well, bore children, and managed her household without scandal, her chastity was never truly hers again. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband, then to the church who would judge her children's legitimacy, and finally to the grave, where even her tombstone would whisper that she had been pure, as though that had been her life's highest accomplishment. Historians debate whether this obsession with chastity was purely religious, or whether it was cultural, a blend of Roman legacy, Christian theology, and medieval patriarchy. But for the girls who lived it, the origin didn't matter. The weight was the same. Reflective pause settles, gentle and unmarked. Not every silence is empty. Some were designed that way, on purpose. You picture her now, standing before a mirror polished with cloth and patience. She adjusts her veil, straightens the neckline of her gown, breathes once, slowly. Behind her, the door is still closed. For a moment, she is alone. And in that moment, she does not think about sin, or obedience, or shame. She thinks of running, not to escape, but to feel something that wasn't being measured. Of course, she does not run. She smooths her skirts, folds her hands, and opens the door. Because chastity, once sewn into a girl, was stitched with thread that did not break easily, not even when she wanted it to. They expected her to know everything and speak almost nothing, to anticipate needs, interpret glances, decode moods, and solve problems before they fully formed, all while keeping her voice as soft and spare as candlelight in a drafty room. If she was too quiet, she was dull. If she was too talkative, she was suspect. But if she spoke with purpose, measured, clear, but never too clever, she was said to possess a wise woman's grace. Not wisdom itself, just enough of its glow to be useful. In noble medieval history, the ideal wife was not an ornament. She was an operator hidden in plain sight, a woman expected to manage, organize, soothe, and strategize as long as no one noticed she was doing it. It's a contradiction so dense you can barely see through it. She must be able to run a household of 30 servants, keep the accounts balanced to the last grain, negotiate with merchants, raise children, advise her husband, and manage visiting in-laws. But she must do so under the pretense that she was merely fulfilling his will, not forming her own. She could not be seen planning, only reacting. She could not be known for her mind, only her intuition. And if she ever corrected a man in public, even gently, even rightly, the room chilled like the door had opened to a sudden wind. So she became a mirror, not a flat one, but curved one that reflected truth with just enough distortion to protect the person looking into it. Her opinions were often framed as questions, her insights as suggestions, her leadership as support. Perhaps my lord would prefer the ledger be reviewed before the next feast. It may be wise to delay the letter until after the bishop has gone. Every sentence softened, every intention veiled. The danger was in visibility, not of her face, but of her thoughts. There are letters, many unsigned, believed to be penned by noble women who advised husbands through war, famine, and political intrigue. Their handwriting loops with elegance, their margins filled with subtle calculations. Yet the letters often begin with disclaimers. Though I am unlearned, as one who knows little of such matters, performative humilities offered not because they were true, but because they were necessary. She knew precisely how much she knew. What she didn't know was how long she could hold that knowledge before someone decided it was dangerous. A woman too intelligent might attract suspicion. A wife who advised too well might be accused of overreach. And in court circles, where whispers curled sharper than blades, the slightest trace of perceived manipulation could become scandal. So she learned to lace her wisdom in flower, in linen, in garden paths and seating charts, and the careful spacing of platters during a feast. Her intelligence became a domestic language, one only other women could read fluently. They saw the extra candle placed near the bishop's seat, not just for light, but to mask the scent of salted fish. They understood why the door to the south hall was left ajar during the meeting, so the steward could hear without entering. These were signals, decisions, messages all delivered without words. And yet, her silence was never mistaken for emptiness by those who had eyes to see. Servants knew, children knew, even the animals, it seemed, responded to her voice, which rarely rose but always landed. She may not have been able to read Latin, many noble women weren't formally taught, but she read everything else. The tone of a guest's voice as he complimented the bread, the sudden absence of a ring from her husband's finger, the way a maid folded a cloth too slowly after returning from the village. Every detail mattered. Every detail meant something. But none of it could be discussed openly. Her skill was in prediction, in prevention. She stopped problems before they arrived, calmed tensions before they sparked, managed men's egos like fragile glass without ever letting on that her hands were holding them. Yet, in doing so, she bore another kind of weight, the loneliness of a mind that must always be careful. There were few she could confide in, perhaps a sister, if one remained nearby, a nursemaid from her childhood, now gray but still steady, a confessor, if he listened more than he judged. But more often than not, her confidant was silence itself, the echo of her own thoughts as she walked the edge of the garden, or folded linens late into the evening, not because they needed folding, but because her thoughts needed company. One noblewoman in the late 14th century kept a book of household recipes in which, nestled between instructions for preserving lemons and dyeing wool, are short reflections barely longer than a breath. The steward lies. He meant to leave last week. Best serve less mead next time. They're not notes for cooking. They're quiet signals to herself. A ledger of insight disguised as spice. Historians marvel at these fragments not just for their content, but for their concealment. They show how a woman's mind had to live in the margins, and though she knew how to bend her voice around a room like incense, there were times she wanted to speak plainly. When a man lied and was praised for confidence, when a decision was made badly and she was left to clean the mess, when someone younger, louder, less thoughtful repeated her own advice as if it were original and was celebrated. Those were the moments she might retreat into a chapel, sit where the stone was coldest, and say nothing at all, not because she lacked words, but because she had too many, and nowhere safe to place them. She was never foolish enough to envy peasant women. Their lives were harder in ways she could only imagine. But sometimes, late at night, she envied their honesty, their right to raise their voices when needed, to curse out loud when the stew boiled over, to scream during birth without worrying who might overhear. That kind of freedom wasn't high-born. It was raw and rare, and still, she held her place, not out of weakness, but because it was the only place from which she could move the pieces. And move them she did, quietly, constantly. A marriage saved here, a household kept from collapse, a servant prevented from punishment by a whisper in the right ear. It added up not to recognition, but to resilience. Even today, traces of these women remain, not in the chronicles of kings, but in the rhythms of survival that ran beneath them. One could argue they shaped history not by what they said, but by what they kept from happening. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. Some lessons are never written down, never announced, never even named. They arrive in glances, in hesitations, in the faint adjustments of a hand setting down a cup. They pass not through instruction, but through quiet imitation, one generation watching the next, with a kind of invisible tether, hoping that gesture will substitute for speech. That posture will replace warning. That instinct, if repeated often enough, will become inheritance. In the world of medieval history, no book taught a girl how to be married. There were sermons on chastity, tracts on obedience, and saints' lives meant to inspire piety. But no scroll explained the domestic codes that truly governed her life. She learned instead by watching, mostly her mother, sometimes her grandmother, occasionally a widow who lived long enough to grow weary of the performance and, in quiet acts of rebellion, stopped pretending. It was the way her mother sat at the feast table that taught her more than the feast itself. Not what she ate, but how. How the spoon was lifted always steady, never hurried. How she waited to speak until others had begun chewing. How her smile stayed in place even when the news was bad, even when the food was late, even when her husband frowned but did not explain why. The spoon, for all its simplicity, became something like a scepter, not in its power, but in its discipline. It had to move smoothly, without slop or gesture, not a flick of the wrist, not a drop spilled onto the linen. One wrong tilt, and someone might whisper that she lacked refinement, that her daughters would never marry well. And so the girl, still young enough to fidget, but old enough to understand what silence meant, began to study. She watched how her mother folded her napkin, not just at the end of the meal, but during it, a signal that the conversation had taken a turn, that something had been said which now required careful, unspoken attention. She noticed how her mother never reached for the bread first, even when she had set the table herself, how she deferred with a smile, as if generosity were instinct, not performance. And over time, the girl learned. Her gestures grew smaller, her voice softer, her appetite subdued, but never absent too little food, after all, might imply illness, and no suitor wanted a fragile wife, but not too much either, or someone might say she was greedy, careless, or worst of all, forgetful of her image. Even at home, when no guests visited and the only company was kin, the performance endured, because practice was perpetual. Habits could not be turned on and off like candlelight. They had to become muscle memory. In those moments, the mother rarely spoke directly. She might correct her daughter's spoon grip with a light touch or a narrowing of the eyes, but she never said, "You are being prepared." It wasn't cruelty. It was containment, a way to preserve the girl's place in a system neither of them controlled. A mother didn't teach her daughter how to be free. She taught her how to survive without attracting notice. There's a surviving household account from a 15th century manor that lists the breakage of 3 spoons, all attributed to the kitchen girl, never to the lady. The record is cold, but telling. A broken spoon wasn't merely a utensil lost. It was a crack in the image of control. The women upstairs didn't break spoons. They held them, carefully, forever. And the spoon was just one thing. There was the way her mother walked across a room, always knowing who was watching, even when pretending not to notice. The way she stood beside her husband during greetings, never too close to imply intimacy, never too far to suggest indifference. The way she bent slightly when thanking a guest for a compliment, gracious, but never enthusiastic. Enthusiasm could be dangerous. It could signal longing, and longing, in a married woman, needed to be buried deep. What's difficult to accept is how much of this wasn't taught with words. Girls were expected to infer, to absorb, to mold themselves according to the blueprint. They were given a blueprint that shifted slightly with every new household, every regional custom, every whispered change in status. There was no handbook, only memory, and memory is flawed, but imitation is precise. When a daughter failed to follow the unspoken rhythm, perhaps speaking before her brother, or laughing a second too long at a guest's joke, the mother's correction was swift and quiet. A hand on the wrist, a delayed glance, a correction slipped into the next morning's sewing instruction. Stitches should be even, like your tone yesterday. No mention of the joke, just the implication. It was enough. There's an old phrase preserved in a Breton diary. She eats like a man, and so she'll marry late. It wasn't meant as cruelty. It was a diagnosis, as if a woman's future could be foretold by the way she bit into her bread. And for many families, it could, because courtship was a language of implication. What a girl said didn't matter nearly as much as what her gestures suggested about her temperament, her discipline, her ability to remain composed under scrutiny. The suitor's family might not speak of the spoon directly, but they would see it, and they would judge. So the mother taught her daughter not just how to move, but how to be still. Stillness was safety. Stillness gave the impression of composure, which was often mistaken for goodness. Stillness also erased desire. A girl who moved too much might seem restless, and restlessness, in a woman, was feared. It suggested ambition, curiosity, hunger, all dangerous things. A still woman was a manageable woman, one who could be guided, predicted, and, if necessary, ignored. This training, repeated for years, etched itself into bone. Some girls embraced it, took pride in their grace. Others felt it like a tightening thread around the ribs, each day cinching a little more. A few rebelled with laughter too loud, with bites too full, with words not softened for company, but they were often remembered not for their spirit, but for their failure. Still, the mother continued, because it was all she could offer. A set of invisible tools, lessons that couldn't be praised openly, but whose absence would be punished. And maybe, in her quietest moments in the hour before dawn, when the fire had gone out and her body ached from sitting too long in the same upright pose, the mother questioned it, wondered what she had passed on, whether this ritual of spoons and glances and folded hands had preserved her daughter, or simply prepared her for a quieter kind of erasure. But she didn't say it, because her own mother hadn't said it, because breaking the pattern required not just courage, but the space to be heard. And women like her had never been given that space, only the room to perform, and the duty to teach others how. You wonder, then, how many generations learned by watching? How many gestures carried forward, not because they were beautiful or useful, but because they were safe? How many daughters copied hands that stirred without spilling, voices that curved downward at the end of every sentence, eyes that never met the guests for too long? And how many of them, later, as they sat beside their own daughters, wondered whether it was too late to teach something else, not grace, not silence, but freedom. Even if it came with clumsy spoons, there was no applause, no fanfare, no moment where she stood on a threshold and was told, directly and clearly, what her life would now become. The handover happened quietly, sometimes beneath a banner, sometimes at the edge of a muddy road, but always with more ceremony for the objects she brought than for the body she inhabited. In the heart of medieval history, marriage among noble families was rarely romantic and never optional. A girl was not given away. She was exchanged. And in that exchange, something essential within her was both preserved and erased. The preservation was practical: her name, her virtue, her ability to carry on someone else's legacy. The erasure was personal: her voice, her choice, her memory of being something other than a part of someone else's house. The transition was ritualistic, but also alarmingly transactional. When two noble families negotiated a union, the girl was rarely present during the discussions. Contracts were written, clauses debated, dowries inventoried down to the silver hairpins. They negotiated over sheep, vassal loyalties, border claims, and the exact volume of wine owed during feast days. When the agreement was finally struck, a scribe would set the seal, and only then would someone turn and tell her to prepare. There's an account from a 14th century Italian household in which a nobleman is recorded as saying, "My daughter is now his." That was it. 4 words. No blessings, no goodbyes, just transfer of ownership, clean as ink on parchment. The phrase wasn't symbolic, it was legal. And when the day came, the day when she was dressed, braided, laced into brocade and fur, she had not chosen, she did not walk down an aisle in joy. She stepped forward as a duty fulfilled. Sometimes she had met the man, sometimes not. Occasionally she had spoken to him, often she hadn't, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that everything aligned: lineage, land, and loyalty. Love was neither assumed nor required. At the exchange, her father might shake hands with the groom, or with the groom's father, depending on status. A priest might offer a blessing, if the church was present. But the attention quickly shifted to the goods trunks of fabric, ledgers of coin, livestock tallies. The dowry was not background, it was centerpiece. And then came the moment so often, written without detail, where she stepped from one threshold to another, from her father's house into her husband's, or into the carriage that would take her there. One home blurred into another, and she was not to look back. She had been trained for this moment, of course, schooled in courtesy, embroidery, family names, feast etiquette. Perhaps she could even read psalms in Latin, enough to impress a visiting bishop. She had been told how to kneel, how to serve, how to wait. What she had not been told was how to mourn the home she was leaving, not because it had been a paradise, but because it had been familiar. No one prepared her for the ache of her mother's voice fading behind her, or the way her bedroom door had clicked for the last time without ceremony. No one warned her that the servants who once called her little dove would now bow with detachment, no longer hers to comfort. Everything she had touched became someone else's the moment she was touched. And still, she went, because to hesitate would bring shame, to cry might bring insult, to run unthinkable. Even the clothing reminded her of this shift. Many girls were dressed in bridal gowns stitched by women who were not their kin. Sometimes, the colors were chosen to match the husband's crest. Sometimes, the cloth was dyed with herbs she did not recognize, and when she looked down, the hands that smoothed her skirts were no longer the hands she had known since childhood. They belonged to strangers preparing her to become one of them. Her hair, often bound in childhood plaits, was undone and woven anew, A crown of woven metal might be placed on her brow. It was not heavy, but she would feel its weight for years. There are paintings from the period muted in palette, almost painfully formal, where the bride and groom stand side by side, gazes fixed straight ahead. Between them, a dog, a mirror, a single candle, each symbol heavy with implication: fidelity, clarity, surrender. But behind their faces is no laughter, no warmth, just posture. Some argue that these girls were fortunate elevated from one noble house into another, that they would be protected, provided for, perhaps even respected. And in many cases, that was true. A good marriage could ensure stability, children, alliances. It could offer space, privacy, even affection. But affection was a risk. It had to grow silently, carefully, like ivy against stone. And in the worst cases, when the husband was cruel, when the household was hostile, when childbirth came too soon or too often, affection never stood a chance. Still, the system endured because it served the names, not the people. And over time, the girl adapted. She learned the layout of a new hall, the smell of different bread, the rhythm of servants whose eyes did not yet meet hers. She memorized names, mapped loyalties, adjusted her expectations. She learned how the light came through her new bedroom window, not in the gentle slope she was used to, but sharper, as if the glass itself had no time for softness. Some wrote letters home, asking for familiar spices or news of a sibling's marriage. Most kept their words formal. Few admitted that they wept during the first week, or that their stomach turned each time they heard unfamiliar footsteps in the corridor. Even fewer confessed how long it took for their bodies to stop recoiling from touch. And yet, many found a way, not through rebellion, but through rhythm. They built routines, gained allies, found affection in a child's laugh, a maid's loyalty, a husband's occasional kindness. It wasn't always enough, but it was something. One French manuscript records a lady of the house who, in her final years, instructed her granddaughter on how to survive marriage. The advice was simple: smile when uncertain, speak only when the candle is tall, and always keep a second key. The meaning of the last phrase is still debated, perhaps literal, perhaps metaphorical. Either way, it speaks to a quiet strategy, the knowledge that survival required both compliance and subtle resistance. Because even though she had been exchanged like a coin, she was not hollow. She carried memories, the texture of her mother's voice, the smell of old parchment in the corner of her father's library, the creak of a familiar stair, the way the sky looked just before the winter frost. No one could take those from her. And so, while her name changed, her title shifted, and her rooms were reassigned, some small part of her remained, tucked away, untouched, waiting. If anything in this stayed behind, you can leave something below, or not. It still counts. This is Boring History Nights. She had known it was coming. Everyone had. From the moment the contract was signed, the trunks packed, the prayers whispered. The first night stood on the horizon like a chapel bell waiting to be rung. And still, nothing could fully prepare her for the way it arrived, not in grand gestures, not in some dramatic unveiling of passion or fear, but in a strange, quiet surrender. The way a gate opens when no one is watching, the way water seeps through stone. In medieval history, a noblewoman's first night in marriage was more ritual than romance. It was less a moment of intimacy than a confirmation of transaction, a solemn formality, cloaked in the language of tradition and sealed, quite literally, by the expectations of lineage and proof. For some, there were witnesses, not in the room itself, but close enough to hear, to verify, to document. A practice both horrifying and mundane in its frequency. The stained sheets were shown the next morning, paraded like a contract signature, as though the body's pain could be transformed into legal satisfaction. In certain noble houses, a chamberlain or senior servant was charged with waiting outside the bridal room, not out of curiosity, but out of duty. Some accounts describe them holding torches as the couple entered, as if guiding lambs to a symbolic slaughter. And yet, for all the formality, the event was deeply personal and often bewildering. A girl raised on whispers and caution, whose body had always been guarded like a fortress, suddenly found herself expected to welcome the one thing she'd been warned against, and she was expected to do it gracefully, silently, without fear or protest. Consent, in this context, was not discussed. It was assumed, built into the vows, embedded in the fabric of obedience. A wife was not meant to withhold, not because she lacked desire, but because desire was never considered hers to possess in the first place. Her body, like her name, belonged now to someone else. Even if he was gentle, even if he waited, even if he offered warmth, the power was still imbalanced. And for many girls, gentleness never arrived. There are records of noble women who confessed, years later, that they had not understood what was happening until well after it began. That the act was less pain than confusion, less fear than detachment, as though they had stepped outside their own skin and simply watched it occur. Some recalled clutching bedposts. Others remembered the sound of the wind outside more clearly than the face of the man beside them. And yet, they did not scream. Most did not cry. They had been trained too well for that. Instead, they breathed shallowly, prayed softly, closed their eyes not to pretend it wasn't happening, but to make it more bearable. They told themselves it was duty, that it was the start of something important, that this was how families began. Sometimes, after it was over, they were left alone. The husband returned to a feast, to drink with his companions and confirm that the line was secured. The bride remained in the chamber, aching in ways she hadn't expected, wondering what part of her had changed now that it had been claimed. In some cases, a midwife might visit discreetly the following day to ensure the girl had not been injured too severely. She would check for tearing, for signs of trauma, and offer a tonic if needed. No one asked how the girl felt, only whether she bled. There is a phrase scribbled in the corner of a Flemish prayer book, likely by a woman's hand, tucked beneath a psalm that reads, "I did not open, I was opened." A simple line, but devastating, because it tells the truth, not about violence, but about agency, about how even in the absence of brutality, absence itself can be a kind of wound. Historians often debate how common it was for noble women to suffer during their first night, whether brutality was the rule or the exception. But the statistics miss the point. The true ache lies not in how often it hurt, but in how little it mattered. Whether joyful or grim, it was expected to be endured. Endurance, after all, was her first lesson. Over time, some found a rhythm. They learned their husbands' patterns, anticipated the nights when they would be summoned. Some even found kindness their companionship, tenderness, the slow unfolding of affection. But that came later, if it came at all. The first night remained, always, like a closed book pressed between heavier volumes, not returned to, not read aloud. For a few, that first night marked the start of something gentler. A man who asked permission, who listened, who held her afterward. And in those rare cases, women sometimes wrote of it as a turning, not of body, but of trust. A moment where fear softened into something else. Not love, perhaps, but safety. Still, even in those softer moments, the shadow lingered, because even the kindest man could not undo the expectations the world had woven into her skin. She still belonged. She still was watched. Her belly would now be monitored for swelling, her mood for signs of pregnancy. Her every movement would be filtered through the question of whether she had conceived. The first night might be over, but its consequences had only just begun. And if no child came, then came doubt. Quiet, at first. A sideways glance from a mother-in-law, a priest's comment during confession, tinctures offered without request, a pressure that built without words. The irony, of course, was that men were rarely blamed. Infertility was a woman's burden, even when the cause was unspoken, her womb, her fault. So she learned to smile, to accept the offerings, to drink the tonics and pretend they didn't taste of iron and desperation. She learned to chart her days, to pray at the statue of Saint Anne, to feel every shift in her body as both omen and accusation. All this began with the first night, a night that wasn't hers, a night she didn't claim, a night she had to carry, not as memory, but as requirement. Still, she didn't break, because she was never taught how to. It was never spoken directly, not in the open, and certainly not to her face, but it was always understood her worth. From this point on would be measured not by who she was, or how she spoke, or what she carried through her days, but by the children she bore, and more precisely, the sons. A girl who had once been wrapped in silk and instructed in modesty now became something else entirely, a vessel of legacy, a steward of lineage, the quiet architect behind the next generation of lords, knights, and names. In medieval history, motherhood was not a transformation. It was a test, and one she was expected to pass without complaint, delay, or deviation. The birth of a son changed everything. Not only did it secure the marriage, reinforce the dowry's value, and quiet in-laws who may have grumbled about her posture or parentage, but it also, in many ways, allowed her to remain. In households where alliances were fragile and second marriages common, a wife who produced sons quickly, especially strong, healthy, early maturing ones was less likely to be replaced. Her position, once defined by hope, was now defended by flesh and blood. Yet the pressure didn't disappear once the boy arrived. It shifted, hardened, grew. She was now the guardian of their futures, and failure, even a subtle, creeping failure, could unravel everything she had managed to secure. It wasn't enough that she loved them. She had to shape them, carefully, ruthlessly, even, because the world they would enter of feasts, politics, swordplay, and oath would not love them back, and she knew it. There's a manuscript from the mid-13th century, part of a noble family's private archive, that outlines child-rearing practices. It lists maternal traits desirable in a lady of standing, including gentleness of voice, strength in discipline, and, curiously, the ability to correct without tears. The phrase has lingered in academic circles because it captures the strange blend of tenderness and vigilance expected of noble mothers. They were to be loving, but never soft, wise, but never questioning, present, but never clinging. She learned, then, to speak to her sons with warmth, but never indulgence, to soothe their wounds without showing too much fear, to watch their tempers for signs of danger, not for the harm they might suffer, but for the harm they might one day cause. Because a nobleman's strength was prized, unless it turned reckless, And a noble mother was praised for shaping sons who could wield power without misusing it, even if she was never thanked for the work it required. The nursery, contrary to modern expectations, was not always a place of sweetness. It was a proving ground. By the age of 7, boys were expected to show discipline. They were watched for their posture, their endurance, their resistance to tears. If they tripped, they were expected to rise quickly. If they argued, they had to do so with poise. The lady of the house, their mother, was often the one orchestrating these standards behind the curtain. She might have had a wet nurse, a governess, a tutor, but her presence was felt even when she wasn't in the room. Her sons heard about her approval, even if they rarely saw it expressed outright. A well-made bed, a correctly recited prayer, a clean report from the steward all became moments to be noted. A single raised eyebrow at dinner might be more meaningful than an entire afternoon of praise. And if she had daughters, she raised them too. But the tone changed. Daughters were prepared to serve, to listen, to become what she herself had once been. It was a cruel echo, one she could neither stop nor ignore. In her quietest moments, she might have dreamed of changing it, of preparing her daughter not for obedience, but for courage. Yet she knew the cost of such deviation, and often painfully chose to protect her daughter through conformity, not rebellion. Still, the sons became the project, not because they mattered more to her, but because they mattered more to everyone else. She taught them, as best she could, to see the world without cruelty, but also without illusion. When they asked questions, she answered with precision, never too much detail, never too much softness. You must learn to wait. Not every truth must be said aloud. Strength is not the same as loudness. These were her teachings, veiled in everyday gestures. She corrected them in ways their fathers never noticed. A hand placed on a shoulder before a meeting, a glance exchanged at table, a story told just before sleep about a knight who failed because he lacked patience, or a prince who was loved because he listened. Not sermon stories. That was how she passed on what she could. And it was exhausting, because the stakes were high, and the praise, when it came, was rarely hers. If a son succeeded, it was because of his father's blood, his knightly tutor, the wisdom of men who shaped him. If he failed, the household whispered that perhaps he had been too coddled, perhaps his mother had been too protective, or too distracted, or too present. There is a cold phrase that appears in the correspondence of a baron, writing to his steward, "Her sons are still soft. See that she attends more closely to their education," as if hardness were the only goal, as if failure to raise a weapon-ready boy was reason enough to question the woman who bore him. And so she tried harder. Not through force, but through vigilance. She watched for weakness in the boys, not to shame it, but to shield it until it could be reshaped. She let them cry once, maybe twice, but not a third time, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much to let them remain vulnerable. At night, she sometimes returned to her chamber with aching arms, having held a child through fever or fear, and sat in silence before the fire, wondering how much of herself she had already given away, not just to her husband, not just to her family's name, but now, to these children, to these sons who would one day leave, marry, carry forward her blood without her name. And that, too, she bore, because this was her role, not just to birth, not just to nurture, but to prepare them fully for a world that would not thank them for being gentle, but might punish them all the more if they were not. Still, she sometimes rebelled. Not openly, not in ways that could be tracked, but in small moments, letting a son sleep longer when he was weary, telling him stories not of conquest, but of mercy, singing to him quietly, even after the nurse had gone, giving him, just for a few minutes, the softness the world would try to beat out of him later. These moments left no record, but they mattered. Because a son raised without love may grow into power, but a son raised with even a sliver of tenderness might. One day, remember what it meant to be held not because he had earned it, but because he was simply there. That was her hope, not that they would rise, but that they would remember. And in that remembering, carry her forward not as a name, not as a lineage, not as a whisper behind the throne, but as the voice that taught them how to listen. The bruises were rarely visible. The worst ones never are. Not the purpling of skin or the split of flesh, but the dull, heavy imprint left by disappointment, by silence, by the endless balancing of expectations that were never spoken yet never negotiable. She could have endured pain. Many women did through childbirth, illness, the thousand small abrasions of duty, but this was something different. This was erosion, slow and quiet, the kind that wears a person down without ever leaving a mark deep enough to justify complaint. In medieval history, a noblewoman's suffering was not an aberration. It was a norm so deeply ingrained that to resist it, to even name it, could brand her as disloyal, unstable, or most dangerously ungrateful, because she was supposed to have everything: a roof, a name, a place, and above all, a husband. What more could she want? The bruises began in small places: a door that closed too hard, a word spoken in jest that landed like iron, a hand that lingered too long on her arm, not in affection, but in possession, a correction made in public, masked as humor but meant as control. These were not the grand violences that filled ballads or cautionary tales. They were not loud enough to echo through halls, but they stayed. She might have flinched once early, before she learned. After that, she trained herself not to react, because reaction brought attention, and attention brought more of the same. So she learned to smooth her features, to move carefully, to speak just enough and never more. She became skilled at preemption, anticipating moods, reading silences, calculating how to tilt her voice so that her presence neither provoked nor disappeared. And still, it wasn't enough. There were days when he did not speak, days when he drank too much and stared at her as if he was trying to remember why she was there, days when he spoke too much, too quickly, accusing her of things even he could not name. A missing ring, a servant's mistake, a glance that lasted half a heartbeat longer than expected. The truth didn't matter, only that his discontent found a place to land. That place was her. She tried to confide, once, in her mother-in-law, a careful comment about sleepless nights, about tension in the air, but the woman, older and polished smooth by decades of endurance, only smiled and said, "It gets easier once you stop expecting anything." Then changed the subject to embroidery. So she stopped expecting. She continued to fulfill her duties, managed the estate, hosted feast days, nursed their children when they were ill, maintained the staff. She made sure the wine arrived on time and the firewood was dry and the bread never stale. She remembered birthdays, patron saints, preferred dishes. She ensured his boots were repaired before he noticed they had worn thin. All while something inside her began to curl inward, because it wasn't only the man, it was the system, the rituals, the endless parade of obligations that masqueraded as affection, the church that told her to obey, the neighbors who told her to be patient, the maids who looked away when he raised his voice, the priest who offered prayers but never questions. Even the silence became complicit. One night, while sitting alone in the solar, she pricked her finger on a needle and didn't flinch, not because it didn't hurt, but because pain had become background noise, the hum beneath her daily tasks. It was not that she lacked feeling. It was that she no longer trusted it to help. There's a marginal note in a Welsh psalter, believed to have been added by a noblewoman around the 12th century. It reads, "He does not see what he breaks." Just that. Not a complaint, not a curse, just a statement, stark and final, and perhaps truer than any confession. She wasn't the only one. Other women endured in different ways. Some retreated into religion, fasting, praying, offering their suffering as penance for unnamed sins. Some turned cold, speaking only when required, raising their children with a kind of practiced detachment. Some escaped in subtler ways in books, in music, in long walks through orchards where no one followed. And a few, the rare, the reckless, or the desperate, found solace in the arms of another, a stable hand, a traveling priest, a visiting cousin. But those stories usually ended in silence, disgrace, or worse. So most women did not risk it. She stayed, not because she lacked courage, but because there was nowhere else to go. Divorce, in most regions, was unthinkable. Separation, while technically possible through church channels, required wealth, influence, or the kind of scandal that brought more shame than relief. And even if she left, what then a return to her father's house, now occupied by another generation? A life of whispered rumors, of being the one who couldn't endure what other women had borne for centuries. So she endured, because that was what noble women were trained to do, to carry without being carried, to bleed without staining, to bear without breaking. And sometimes, in the midst of it, she still laughed, not always bitterly, sometimes genuinely, at the antics of her children, at a joke shared by a visiting sister, at the absurdity of life, how a woman could be both the pillar of a household and the ghost within it. She still dreamed, too, quiet, domestic dreams, of peace, of a night where no footsteps startled her from sleep, of a morning where she was thanked, just once, without being expected to smile in return. Historians sometimes marvel at how little resistance is recorded in the lives of noble women, how few revolts, how few rebellions. But perhaps the absence is not because they lacked fire. Perhaps it's because their revolutions were internal, because they had learned the hard truth of survival, that sometimes the most radical act was staying alive in a world designed to erase you. She did not write poetry. She did not pen treatises. Her name did not appear in chronicles, but she survived, and in doing so, passed down something essential, a look, a habit, a whispered warning to a daughter who might face the same. Even when her body began to ache with age, with knees stiff from kneeling, hands sore from embroidery, shoulders hunched from a lifetime of tension, she did not collapse. She moved slower, perhaps, spoke less, but she remained. Because sometimes endurance is not submission, it is the refusal to disappear. He rarely said anything, not when she woke early to ensure the fires were lit before dawn, nor when she remembered, without prompting, the exact pattern of his late mother's feast day embroidery and recreated it on the new banquet cloth. He did not comment on the way she smoothed over the steward's accounting error before it reached the bishop, or how she managed to host guests for 2 nights straight on fewer supplies than should have sufficed for one. Praise from a husband, she had come to learn, was not expected. And when it came, it was often indirect, clothed in formality or shared with someone else entirely. The house runs well, he might say to his cousin, with a nod in her direction that stopped just short of acknowledgement. In medieval history, a noblewoman was not taught to seek affirmation from her spouse. She was taught to please God, to respect her house, and more than anything, to be beyond the need of recognition. And when she did seek confirmation of her worth, She did not look to the man whose ring she wore. She looked to the church. It was in the confessional that she was most often permitted to be seen, not seen as beautiful or clever or capable, but as spiritual, as worthy of grace, as someone who bore the burdens of her station with quiet humility. It was here that she might finally be told that her efforts were noticed not in their results, but in their endurance. The confessor did not praise her cooking or her ability to manage disputes between servants. He praised her patience, her restraint, the way she bore injustice without rising against it, her refusal to gossip, even when she had cause, her composure during Lent, her attendance at Mass, even on the coldest mornings. This was the currency in which she was paid. She might enter the chapel weary from a week of impossible decisions, a sick child, a sullen husband, a feast half ruined by late deliveries, and kneel with the sense that no one had truly seen her. And then the priest would say, "You are an example to the younger wives," and the ache in her chest would loosen slightly, not because the words filled her, but because they made her visible, if only briefly. Her husband, by contrast, often saw her as part of the house itself, like a well-polished floor or a heavy curtain drawn to block the wind. Useful, expected, an element of the environment. Even in moments of intimacy, a rare laugh shared, a shared glance over a sleeping child, there was seldom any language to honor what she gave. And so she gave it anyway, because she had learned that love, in her world, was not a transaction. It was not even a bond. It was an act of quiet constancy. To love was to remain, to serve, to see the needs before they were spoken, and to accept that one might never be thanked. Still, the heart desires what the mind has learned to live without. And there were nights, especially when the house had gone quiet, when she found herself staring at the flicker of firelight against the ceiling, wondering whether he had ever truly noticed her, whether he could name her favorite scent, or recall the story she had told last month about her uncle's orchard, whether he had ever watched her when she wasn't speaking, whether he had ever truly listened. Sometimes she imagined a different life, not with a different man, but with the same one, softened, one who turned to her during a meal and asked what she thought, who, after a long day, thanked her not for the food, but for the effort, who reached for her hand not as a summons, but as a gesture of presence. And then she folded the thought away, like a letter unsent, because hope, when left too long in the open, becomes vulnerability, and she could not afford to be vulnerable, not when everything she did was designed to preserve the illusion that she needed nothing more than what she had. The church understood this in a way her husband never had to. The priest, though often blind to the world of women, at least recognized their suffering. They called it sanctification. They named it sacrifice. They said that a good wife was like Mary, faithful, enduring, crowned not with garlands, but with grief borne quietly. She absorbed this, not as a doctrine, but as a rhythm. There is a letter, unsigned, believed to be penned by a woman of minor nobility in the early 1400s, preserved in a folio of devotional materials. It reads, "I do not know if he sees me, but I have learned to be seen by God." That must be enough. That line has echoed across centuries, not because it is profound, but because it is common. It encapsulates a kind of compromised spiritual dignity in the absence of worldly affection. But spiritual dignity doesn't warm a bed on cold nights, nor does it catch the tear that slips down one's cheek after a long, bruising silence. It does not sit beside you when you ache, or carry your thoughts when they grow too heavy to name. And yet, it is what she clung to, because it was the only place where her worth was allowed to exist without being tied to someone else's legacy. To the confessor, she was not merely a vessel for sons, or a keeper of linen, or the final voice in disputes over salt and bread. She was a soul, fragile, prone to weakness, but striving, and striving, in the theology of the time, was more valuable than perfection. So she strove. She confessed thoughts that were never acted on, impatience, bitterness, dreams of escape. Her penance was light 5 prayers, a morning fast, but the weight of those confessions lingered far longer, not because she believed them to be sins, but because they were all she had to offer in exchange for being heard. And sometimes, even the priest faltered. When she spoke of exhaustion, he counseled more prayer. When she hinted at resentment, he reminded her of her vow. When she admitted to wishing, even briefly, for another life, he spoke of Eve and her garden. So she learned to filter, to give him only the acceptable truths. Because even here, even in the sanctuary, she was still a woman in a man's world. Still, she knelt. Still, she whispered. Still, she hoped that somewhere, someone counted the sacrifices that never left a mark, the nights spent waiting, the meals prepared without appetite, the letters written and never sent, the songs hummed to sleeping children who would never know the cost of her lullabies. And when she returned home from chapel, she did not expect her husband to notice the change in her step. She did not expect him to ask what prayers she had spoken, or what truths she had carried there and back. She merely resumed her role, the one that required no script, no applause, no curtain call. But inside, something had shifted, because praise, even when it comes from heaven, can still hold a woman upright in a world that refuses to thank her. They were folded neatly, tied with string, and hidden beneath the lining of a wooden chest that no one ever opened, not because they were forbidden, but because no one thought to look. There were no secrets of state inside, no coded conspiracies or love affairs carefully concealed in metaphors, just paper, ink, and the kind of truth that refused to speak its name aloud. The letters weren't addressed to anyone in particular, sometimes to a sister, sometimes to a friend long married and far away, occasionally to no one at all. A name wasn't always necessary when the only person who would ever read them was the one writing. In the quiet corridors of medieval history, where women were given few spaces to speak, and even fewer to be believed, letter writing offered a rare form of resistance. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dangerous, but it was real. And for women like her women, who lived within the bounds of walls both literal and expected, it was one of the only places where their thoughts could stretch. She never called it a diary. That word didn't exist in the way we understand it. And even if it had, she would have flinched at its intimacy. This wasn't about sentimentality. It was about preservation, of sanity, of voice, of something that hadn't been filtered through another person's expectations. The first letter she wrote began with the word today, not because anything remarkable had happened, but because something had shifted inside her, not with thunder, but with the soft gravity of a chair being moved slightly out of place. She had gone to light a candle in the family chapel and found herself pausing not in reverence, but in thought. And when she returned to her chamber, she reached for parchment. Today, I did not speak until after the sun had passed noon. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a complaint, just an observation, a gentle accounting of hours spent unseen, unheard, required but not remembered. That became the pattern. Letter after letter, some no longer than a few lines, others drifting across the page like the hem of a gown on cold stone. In them, she confessed things she dared not utter aloud, fears about her children, suspicions about her husband's loyalty, a longing for music she hadn't heard since girlhood. Occasionally, she allowed herself humor dry, quiet, and sharp. Today, My husband said the kitchen fire lacked vigor. I considered telling him so did his conversation. It wasn't bitterness. It was breath. And, in a life as tightly corseted by duty as the dresses she wore each morning, these letters were the only place where her lungs could fully expand. She wrote about the weather, about the way the apple tree in the orchard bloomed early this year, and how that might mean frost would follow, about the girl in the kitchens who sang when she thought no one was listening, about the way the chapel smelled after the candles were snuffed wax and ash and something older. She wrote about the dreams that returned with unsettling regularity, standing in a room full of doors, each one locked, hearing her name spoken from behind them. Not shouted, just spoken, over and over again. She didn't sign them, not out of fear, but because there was a part of her, a growing part, that no longer recognized the name she had been given at birth, or the one she bore through marriage. Those names belonged to someone else now, a daughter, a wife, a lady of the house. The woman who wrote these letters was something different, still her, but not entirely. And perhaps that was the point, to remember who she had once been, or at least, who she might have been, if the world had tilted slightly differently. Historians often speak of noble women as symbols of grace, of patience, of piety. But these letters, when they survive, tell another story, not one of rebellion, exactly, but of quiet insistence. They were writing not to change the world, but to prove, even if only to themselves, that they had lived in it, that they had noticed things, that they had thought thoughts no one had invited. There is one such letter, preserved in a fragmentary collection from a noble household in the Burgundian countryside, dated approximately 1441. The handwriting is uneven, suggesting haste or a shaking hand. It ends mid-sentence. I wonder if he would notice if I and then nothing. Scholars debate whether the writer was interrupted, or whether the parchment simply deteriorated. But in that trailing edge, there's more truth than could ever be footnoted. Back in her chamber, the woman gathered her own letters every few months and retied them. Sometimes she reread them, sometimes she didn't. Occasionally, she burned one, not out of shame, but as a form of closure, a ritual, a way of saying this thought has lived long enough. She never intended for anyone to find them. In fact, the idea terrified her. What if someone read them and saw weakness? Or worse, saw strength? What if her husband mistook her reflections for rebellion? What if a confessor deemed her doubts as heresy, her wit as vanity, her sadness as ingratitude? So she hid them, beneath false bottoms in her storage chests, behind loose stones in the hearth, folded into the pages of an illuminated psalter no one else used, places sacred enough that even servants hesitated to intrude. It wasn't only the content that needed hiding, it was the act itself, writing for oneself, not for correspondence, not for record-keeping, but for the sheer act of expression was considered strange, pointless, unfeminine. Men wrote to command, to argue, to chronicle. Women, when they wrote, were supposed to pray or copy scripture. Anything else bordered on indulgence. But she indulged anyway, because sometimes survival isn't about escaping the life you've been given. It's about finding places within it where you can still speak, even if only to yourself. And over time, those letters became more than a private record. They became a quiet testament, a mirror, a map back to herself. On one page, she had written a single line, repeated 12 times, "I am still here." No embellishment, no commentary, just that, over and over. The ink darkening as the words continued, the pen pressing harder with each repetition, a litany not of faith, but of presence. Was she lonely often? Was she defeated? Not quite. There's a kind of strength that grows in silence, a strength not shaped by applause or approval, but by the discipline of showing up, of being the same person, every day, even when no one seems to notice. She was not invisible to herself, and that, in the end, might have been enough. Because while the letters never left the room in which they were written, they carried something that did: a truth, a presence, a mark. She had written herself into existence, not in grand declarations, not in flowing poetry, but in the simple, stubborn act of putting pen to page and refusing to vanish. She didn't need anyone to read them. She only needed to know they were there. There was a mirror in her bedchamber, polished silver, not glass, mounted in a carved walnut frame. It had been a wedding gift from a relative she barely remembered, and over the years it had become more furniture than reflection, something to dust and polish, but not to truly use. It stood across from the window and caught the morning light, often casting a pale shimmer across the wooden floor, and the servants had long learned to avoid standing before it too long, not out of superstition, but because it had the unnerving habit of showing too much. She too had avoided it. At first, in the early years of her marriage, she would steal glances, a curl of hair adjusted, a pin straightened, the occasional tilt of the chin to assess whether her new gown sat just right across the collar. But that habit faded quickly, replaced by the more practical work of survival. There was no time to gaze when there were children to dress, guests to welcome, herbs to dry, and a husband to avoid provoking. And so the mirror waited. It aged, in its way. The frame dulled from sunlight, the edges tarnished slightly, a fine crack veining one corner, where a log had fallen from the hearth one winter and struck the base of the stand. But it did not forget its purpose. It watched. She returned to it on a morning that arrived too early and too cold. A morning when the fire had burned too low in the night and her bones ached from the draft. Her hair was unbraided, falling in uneven waves, streaked now with silver that she rarely saw except in candlelight. Her eyes were ringed by a fatigue that had grown so familiar it no longer surprised her, and her skin bore the fine traces of time, not just the years, but the shape of burdens carried too long without complaint. It was not vanity that drew her to the mirror that day. It was curiosity, a quiet, aching need to confirm that she still existed beneath the duties and the silence. What stared back was not ugly, but it was unsettling. She saw a woman whose mouth had learned to stay shut even when her mind was loud. A woman who stood straight not out of pride, but habit. A woman whose hands bore calluses not from fieldwork, but from embroidery and candle wax, and endless doors opened for others. She saw herself not as others did, adorned, poised, composed, but as she was in the moments before anyone entered the room. And it was in that stillness that the truth settled over her. She had grown older without permission. She remembered, dimly, the girl she had been before marriage. She had not been fearless, but she had been curious, full of questions that annoyed her tutors, prone to staring out windows instead of stitching, drawn to the idea that a life could hold more than marriage and prayer. And then the wedding had come, and the children, and the slow erosion of that girl into someone respectable. The mirror showed the cost, not just the age, but the compromise. The hundreds of times she had nodded instead of speaking, the way her voice, once light and quick, had deepened into something slower, more careful. The way her body had learned to disappear into a room, to glide like a shadow when her presence was not required. And yet, she did not turn away. She stayed, studying her reflection, not with self-pity, but with a kind of gentle inventory. She touched the hollow at her collarbone, noting how it had grown deeper. She adjusted the neckline of her shift, frowning at a faint stain that no one would see but her. She looked into her own eyes and searched, not for beauty, but for presence. It was there, dimmer but steady. In medieval history, mirrors were not yet common objects. Many homes had none at all, and those who did often kept them covered when not in use, believing they might reflect more than flesh, perhaps even the soul, or the truth of one's thoughts. Women, especially, were warned against vanity, against gazing too long. A mirror might make a woman forget her station, might tempt her to pride, or worse, self-recognition. But she had no fear of pride. What frightened her was the possibility that she might no longer recognize herself at all. So she began a small ritual, once a week, usually before anyone else stirred. She stood before the mirror just for a moment and looked. Sometimes she noted changes, a new crease beside her mouth, the fading of a bruise that came from bumping a chair while cleaning in the dark. Sometimes she said nothing. Other times, she whispered things to herself that no one else would understand. Still breathing, still here, still mine. Not declarations, anchors. The mirror did not flatter. It did not soften her, but it bore witness. And perhaps that was what she needed most, not reassurance, not praise, but simply a place where she could see herself without distortion, not as a mother, or a lady, or a wife, just as a person, a body, a face, a life that had continued, quietly, through seasons and silences alike. One winter, the mirror was nearly lost. A cousin arrived unannounced, fleeing some court scandal, and brought with her a clamor of trunks and tapestries and demands. In the chaos, the mirror was moved to make room for a dressing table. A servant dropped it. It cracked, the damage far worse than the earlier fracture, a jagged line running from top to bottom like a wound. There was talk of discarding it. The cousin offered to send for a new one from Paris, but she refused, politely, firmly. She had the mirror reset in a plainer frame and returned it to its place by the window. Now, when she looked into it, the crack bisected her reflection. Some might have found this unsettling. She found it honest, because she, too, was divided between roles, between years, between what she had been and what she was becoming. The line across the mirror felt less like damage and more like acknowledgement. We are never whole, she thought. We are only what we carry and what we choose to hold when no one is watching. She began to leave small notes tucked behind the mirror. A thought, a line from a prayer, a single word, enough. Not because she believed in magic, but because she believed in remembering. And as the years wore on, as her hair thinned and her joints ached, and her voice softened into something that strangers sometimes mistook for weakness, the mirror remained. It never lied. It never looked away. It never asked her to be anyone but the person she already was. And in a life where everything else required performance, grace, submission, composure that, at last, was a kind of mercy. It began in the late hours of winter, not with a fever, nor with blood, nor any outward sign that could be pointed to by a physician. Instead, it crept in as silence. First in the mornings when she found it harder to rise, her limbs wrapped in a strange heaviness that sleep never relieved. Then in her appetite, which dulled like a blade left too long in water. She ate to maintain appearances. She smiled when spoken to, but each day, something inside her receded. No one asked what was wrong. Illness in a noble woman was only acknowledged if it disrupted the running of the household or threatened lineage, and hers did neither. The children were clothed, the fires were tended, guests were received with practiced ease. Even her husband, whose regard often failed to reach past the surface of routine, made no mention of her change. Why would he? She still fulfilled her role. What need was there to name a shadow? But she felt it. Like standing waist deep in a cold river, nothing screamed, but everything was numb. In the world of medieval history, such afflictions had no proper name. Melancholia was the term most often whispered by clergy and healers alike, but it was applied with such vagueness that it encompassed everything from grief to demonic influence. If she had been a man, perhaps a scholar, her sadness might have been viewed as evidence of spiritual depth, a temperament inclined toward reflection. But for a woman, especially one of noble blood, persistent sorrow was inconvenient at best and suspect at worst. She did not speak of it, not even in confession. What would she have said? That her bones were too heavy to move some mornings, that light no longer comforted her, and even prayer seemed to echo rather than reach, that her own name, when spoken aloud, felt like someone else's. No. She said her prayers. She fulfilled her penance. She thanked God for the health of her children and the mildness of the winter. And then she folded her hands and felt nothing. It was not that she wanted to die. That would have been easier to confront, perhaps. What unsettled her was the absence of want altogether, no desire for food, or touch, or music. Just a slow drifting into the margins of her own life, like a guest too polite to intrude. She would sit by the window and watch the snow fall, not because it was beautiful, but because it required nothing of her. The world moved, and she did not need to follow. There were days she forgot the sound of her own laughter. Once, she dropped a plate while clearing the table. It shattered loud and final. Everyone turned, startled. Her husband blinked at her, as if waking from a dream. "You should rest," he said, with a trace of irritation. "You look pale." She nodded, but did not go to her room. Instead, she went to the chapel and knelt until her knees ached, whispering a prayer she did not believe, "Make me useful again." Not joyful, not whole, just useful, because in her world, usefulness was the only proof of worth. And she was afraid not of being unloved, but of becoming irrelevant. The illness did not announce itself with crisis. It did not strike her down or leave her bedridden. It remained, stubbornly quiet, like ash that refuses to blow away. She continued her duties. She laughed when prompted. She even took walks in the garden when the weather improved, hoping that movement might summon something like feeling. But nothing bloomed inside her. There was a moment, one only she would remember, when the children were gathered around the hearth, playing with carved animals from the toy chest. One of them, the youngest, turned and pressed a wooden sheep into her hand. "It's sleepy," he said, and laughed. And she nearly wept, not because of the gesture, but because she felt nothing, not tenderness, not gratitude, just a kind of polite confusion, as if she had been handed something from a world she no longer belonged to. She knew enough to be frightened, but she also knew that to name such sadness aloud would be to risk losing what little ground she still stood upon. A wife could be tired, a mother could be overwhelmed, but a noble woman with no joy, no light in her eyes, was viewed with suspicion, as if her sorrow were a fault, or worse, a contagion. So she painted over it. She wore the right colors. She remembered feast days and fasts. She brushed her hair and smiled at visiting relatives, but inside, she folded inward. The only person who noticed, truly noticed, was a servant girl named Ellen, quiet and quick, who had served in her household since childhood. One evening, as she was combing out her mistress's hair, she hesitated and said softly, "You haven't sung this week." It was true. She used to hum without thinking simple melodies, half remembered from her girlhood, stitched into the quiet hours of morning. Now, silence held sway. "I suppose I forgot," she said, meeting the girl's eyes in the mirror. Ellen nodded. "I liked it when you sang." No one else spoke of it again, but something about that exchange stayed with her, the fact that her absence was not complete, that someone, however quietly, had felt her drift. It was not a cure. There would be no cure. But that night, when she returned to her bed, she sat awake long after the candles had been snuffed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her own breath. It was not joy, but it was breath, and in that, there was something like beginning. Over the following weeks, she tried small experiments, not changes she couldn't afford the scrutiny, but flickers of movement. She reread a book she had once loved. She asked for honey with her tea. She lingered in the garden for an extra moment, just to smell the frost-softened earth. The illness did not vanish. It never truly would, but it loosened its grip enough for her to notice the world again. Enough to remember that she once had a favorite flower, that there was a psalm whose rhythm pleased her, that her daughter's laugh had changed since last winter. The act of noticing became her quiet rebellion. No one else saw it. To the world, she remained what she had always been: composed, efficient, devout. But inside, she reclaimed her place. Not as a symbol, not as a role, as a person, still here, still breathing. There was a room at the far end of the east wing, past the linen cupboards and the disused solar, whose door remained closed for as long as anyone could remember. It had no name among the servants, only referred to as her room, though no one could say for certain when she had last entered it or if she ever truly had. It was not locked. It was simply avoided. In a household where every space bore the marks of daily life, the scuff of shoes, the scent of broth, the soft friction of sweeping this chamber, was a stillness in the middle of movement, a held breath in a house full of routine. She had not stepped inside since the year her youngest child died. It had once been a nursery, though the term felt too soft, too bright, for what it had become in her memory. There had been pale curtains, hand-stitched linen, a carved cradle made by a distant cousin. There had been songs, quiet ones, and warm milk at odd hours, and her fingers tracing small patterns on a brow that barely had time to wrinkle. But that time had been brief, a cough, a fever, a silence. And then the room had been closed, not because anyone told her to, but because she could not bear its air. It seemed to hold the last cry still, suspended in the particles of dust that never truly settled. For days, then weeks, and finally years, the door remained untouched. Once, a maid suggested storing spare blankets inside, and she had simply shaken her head. Another time, a guest unaware of the room's past tried the handle in search of the privy. She had heard the creak of the hinges from the corridor and felt the blood drain from her face. She rose too quickly from her chair and nearly collapsed on the stone floor. After that, they placed a stool in front of the door. No explanation was given. In medieval history, grief was often structured. Mourning periods were prescribed by social class and ecclesiastical council. Widows wore black for a year and a day. Children were to be mourned with dignity, especially if they were not heirs. But behind the veils and the rituals, real sorrow had no shape. It seeped into corners. It refused expiration, and in her case, it claimed a room. She did not speak of the child, not because she had forgotten, but because the memory was a knife without a handle. Her other children grew. Her duties continued. But something within her remained in that chamber, caught like a thread in a door that would never quite close. Time moved. Seasons turned. Her hair thinned. Her hands stiffened, but the room waited. One morning, she passed it without thinking and paused. There was nothing remarkable about the day. The air smelled of damp stone and early spring. A bird had nested near the window on the landing, and its song filtered faintly through the corridor. She had been looking for a lost spool of thread, muttering to herself as she searched the shelves. When she realized she had walked past the stool, the door was right there. She reached out, not to open it, but to touch the wood. It felt cold, dry. The grain was still visible beneath the worn polish. Her hand hovered near the handle. She told herself she was only curious, checking if the hinges still held, if the latch had rusted. But she knew this was not about repair. It was about return. She withdrew her hand and stepped back. She was not ready, and that, too, was allowed. Later that evening, in the privacy of her chamber, she took out a piece of parchment. She began a letter with no recipient. It simply said, "I saw your door today." She didn't need to write more. The rest was already inside her. Years passed. She did not open it, but she began to dust the handle. A small thing, a quiet ritual. Once a week, after the corridor had been swept and the candles trimmed, she would pause, take a soft cloth, and gently wipe away what the air had left. No one questioned it. No one noticed. But for her, it was the closest she could come to saying, "I remember. I have not abandoned you." Eventually, she permitted a single chair to be placed in the hallway nearby, not directly in front, but close enough that she could sit without explanation. She took to sewing there sometimes, or simply resting. From that vantage point, she could see the way light touched the door in the afternoon, how the grain caught a faint glow near sunset, how, occasionally, the door seemed to breathe, not literally, of course, but with that strange intimacy that old wood acquires after long silence. She was not waiting for anything. She did not expect some revelation to arrive, nor for the pain to evaporate with time. She had long ceased to believe in the tidy endings of sermons and songs, but she had also come to understand that love, especially the kind that outlives its object, is not a thing to be solved. It is a thing to be kept, like a room. And so she did. She never opened it, but she honored its presence. And in doing so, she began to let herself breathe again. Sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings, she would walk the corridor after everyone had gone to sleep. Her slippers barely made a sound on the stone. She moved slowly, not with fear, but with reverence. And when she reached the door, she would place her palm against it gently, deliberately, and close her eyes. In that moment, there was no title, no household, no expectations. There was only her and the life that had passed through her hands like water. The burial was arranged with all the solemnity expected of her rank. There were veils and incense, processions and prayers. The coffin, carved from pale yew, was draped in cloth of gold that shimmered beneath the overcast sky. Bells tolled not for who she was in life, but for the position she had occupied: wife, mother, lady of the house. Those titles were now past tense, embroidered onto memory and sealed beneath stone. Few wept openly. In the world she left behind, grief was a private affair, tidied into rituals and measured by silence. Her daughters bowed their heads with the grace they had been taught. Her sons murmured prayers without looking at one another. And her husband, older now, slower, stood with gloved hands clenched at his sides, his face as unreadable as it had always been. There was no storm, no wind, no heavenly sign to mark the moment the earth accepted her. Only the gentle thud of soil upon wood and the quiet shuffle of shoes as mourners dispersed. But beneath the layers of etiquette and custom, something else lingered, something no one could name aloud, yet many felt. It was not peace. It was not rest. It was rage. Not the kind that flares or screams, not the kind that strikes out and demands retribution. No, this rage was older, more disciplined. It had learned to smile through pain, to host dinners while bleeding, to bow and kneel and whisper yes while the soul inside wanted to howl. It had lived inside her ribs for years, pressed flat by duty and expectation, and now, in death. It had nowhere else to go but out into the walls, into the floors, into the very soil that closed around her. In medieval history, noble women were rarely remembered for their anger. They were idealized for patience, celebrated for submission. Their legacy, if recorded at all, was filtered through the language of grace and obedience. But she had not been merely graceful. She had endured, and endurance, too, leaves a residue. After the burial, the household carried on. Trays were cleared, linens washed, schedules resumed. Her name was spoken less each day, until eventually it became a matter of record rather than memory. A woman who had once presided over feast days and births, who had stitched banners and managed debts, was now simply a line in the family ledger, deceased, interred, noted. But the room she had died in remained exactly as she had left it. No one wanted to clear it. At first, her husband claimed it was respect. "Let the chamber rest," he said. "Let her things lie undisturbed." But as the seasons passed and dust gathered on the windowsills, it became clear the room had become a kind of warning, as if entering it might stir something no one was prepared to face. Servants avoided it. The youngest children glanced at it as they passed, quickening their steps without meaning to. Even the household priest, when called to bless the space, had hesitated before crossing the threshold. He had whispered the prayers, he had sprinkled the holy water, but afterward, he had muttered to no one in particular, "Some things remain," and remain they did. In her final years, she had taken to writing not letters, not journals, but phrases on scraps of parchment, sentences that made little sense to others, but which she folded and tucked into hidden corners, beneath floorboards, behind shelves, inside the binding of a book she never loaned. They were not confessions, they were declarations, not loud, not public, but fierce in their stillness. "You cannot love what you refuse to see. They taught me to be quiet, so I screamed with my bones. My rage is not unbecoming, it is what kept me alive." When the eldest daughter found one of these notes tucked behind a tapestry that had fallen slightly askew, she read it twice and did not tell anyone. She folded it carefully and slipped it into the sleeve of her dress. That night, she dreamt of her mother's voice, not as it had been in life, but as something stronger, less filtered, more vast. The rage was not madness. It was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was truth, the truth of a woman who had been shaped to please, yet had held space for her own soul in secret. A woman who had played the game, who had smiled and borne sons and stitched banners, but who had not surrendered entirely, who had carved out hidden corners where her real self could breathe. It was said that her eyes, in her final moments, had turned not toward heaven, but toward the hearth, as if looking for something she had buried there long ago. A thought, a promise, a version of herself no one else had ever fully known. And perhaps that was what haunted the room, not her spirit, as the servants feared, but her intention, her unwillingness to be erased. There are stories, quiet ones, not written down, of women like her, women who did what was asked, and more, who upheld families, who bent to laws, who bore the weight of reputation without faltering. But beneath that surface was something else, the knowledge that endurance is not weakness, and silence is not the same as consent. These stories do not end in revolution. They end in echoes. In the whisper of fabric when a daughter walks through her mother's chamber for the first time since the burial. In the deliberate act of placing her name in the family book, not in the margin, but at the top of the page. In the decision to remember her not as a vessel, but as a fire banked, but not extinguished. They say her garden bloomed brighter the spring after her death, that wildflowers spread where none had grown before, that the birds nested lower in the hedges, and the air felt denser somehow, as if holding its breath. Some called it coincidence, others blessing. But those who had known her, truly known her, suspected it was something else. A last word, spoken not with a voice, but with roots and wind and stubborn bloom. She had gone quietly, but not gently, and the earth remembered. There was no monument built in her name. No stained glass window bore her likeness. No illuminated manuscript lingered long enough to tell her full story. The scribes who recorded the kingdom's affairs mentioned her in passing as wife, as mother, as consort to decisions made beyond her reach. Her titles remained intact, but her voice was buried beneath them, as if silence itself had been her greatest achievement. And yet, she had spoken, not always in words. Often, it was in gesture, in breath, in withheld expression. In a court that watched every movement for meaning, her restraint became its own kind of language. She knew the power of listening without replying, of observing without being seen, of surviving by choosing stillness over spectacle. She had not been born to disappear. Her childhood had not been one of shadows. She had once held the sun in her palm, a daughter of a great house, trained in diplomacy and poised with the elegance of someone raised to be both ornament and weapon. Her father had told her she would marry for strategy, and she had. Her mother had told her to keep her own counsel, and she did. When she entered the royal court as a bride, there had been hope that she might soften its sharper edges, that she might become its conscience, its grace, its unseen anchor. But history rarely writes of anchors. It remembers sails. In the books of medieval history, kings stand alone on the page. Their victories are immortalized, their defeats rationalized. Queens are often set aside as context, not character mentioned in brackets, footnotes, or flourishes of domestic virtue. If a queen acted boldly, she was dangerous. If she receded, she was forgettable. She had done both, and that, perhaps, was her crime. She had loved her children, each with a quiet vigilance, not with open displays or loud favor, but with the steadiness of someone who knew how fragile bloodlines could be. She remembered the names of nurses. She tracked fevers before physicians arrived. She ensured her daughters were taught more than embroidery, though she never claimed credit for it. She watched her sons with a mixture of pride and distance, knowing that their futures would not be hers to shape, only to protect until they left her reach. The court saw her as mild. Even her enemies admitted she was not foolish, but they mistook caution for emptiness, and when the tides of favor shifted, she was easy to forget. Her husband died before her. She stood at his funeral like a statue carved from patience, head bowed, eyes dry, every gesture rehearsed 1,000 times. By then, power had already slipped from her hands. A new generation had taken the throne. Her name was spoken less frequently at council. The retainers bowed, but no longer lingered. She was the past, wrapped in ceremonial lace. Still, she endured. She lived not in exile, but in a kind of soft erasure. Her rooms were moved farther from the center of court. Her correspondence went unopened by some, returned by others. Servants gossiped about her decline, though she remained sharp. She took fewer walks. She sang less often, Her letters became shorter, but she watched. She always watched. And it was in that watching that she preserved what little remained of herself. For history tried, truly tried, to smooth her out, to paint her in broad strokes of obedience or irrelevance. Later chroniclers wrote that she retired from public life, that she left no political mark, that she endured with dignity. What they did not write was that she had sent the letters, that she had written to foreign courts, quietly negotiating the safe return of one child, the political marriage of another, that she had hidden documents meant to destroy allies, that she had intervened, discreetly, in a trial that would have ended in bloodshed. All of it done through the lace and paper of queenship invisible until it moved. Because queens who make noise are remembered as threats, but queens who make silence into strategy, they vanish. Unless someone chooses to remember. There was one portrait, a small one, tucked into the margins of a manuscript now yellowing in a minor archive. It showed a woman in blue, head turned slightly, not quite smiling. No name, no inscription, but her eyes, those remained. And there was a rumor that in the final year of her life, when even the pages who had grown up under her command had moved on, she took to walking alone through the gardens at dawn, not out of melancholy, but to see the frost lift. The gardeners said she whispered to the trees, that she knelt beside broken branches and tied them upright, that she hummed songs no one could identify, not courtly, not foreign, just old. They say that one morning, she sat on the low stone bench beneath the sycamore and never stood again. No one knows how long she was there before she was found. But when they approached, they said her expression was not fearful, not distant, but full of something no record could capture. A kind of peace not given by legacy, but by the knowledge that she had survived in spite of the script written for her. She had been made a wife, then a mother, then a relic. But inside each role, she had carved out a space that belonged only to herself. And that, though no bard would sing it, was her victory. Because what history tried to erase, what it painted over with domestic phrases and ceremonial epithets, was not her deeds, but her selfhood. And that self, that queen who grieved, who endured, who raged without fire and loved without reward, was still there. Not in books, not in stone, but in the pause between pages, in the silence between stories, in the breath that lingers before a name is forgotten. She was not crowned in legend, but she was real. And that, sometimes, is the greater triumph. You've been walking through centuries, haven't you, quietly, gently, like someone moving through a memory you weren't supposed to find. But it found you anyway, in the breath between the stone walls, in the sound of a name that never made it into the books, in the footsteps of women who carried kingdoms without ever holding a crown. You've sat beside their chambers, heard the silence that stretched longer than ceremony, felt the weight of duty stitched into veils and vows, not because anyone told you to feel it, but because it lingers like perfume on an old sleeve, or dust in a sealed room. And maybe that's the strange comfort of it, that you don't need to remember their names to remember their lives. The ache of being chosen for marriage like a trade, the discipline of loving without being seen, the art of holding rage in a teacup and setting it gently on the table without spilling. History did not write their full stories, but you just heard them, not with fanfare, not with armor or flame, but with breath, with stillness, with everything that survives when the world turns away and forgets. You've made it this far, and maybe you're still awake. Or maybe the quiet has taken you, softly, like it once took them, not in surrender, but in rest. Either way, you've walked long enough for one night. Let the walls remember now. Let the floorboards carry the story. And if your thoughts still linger, if your breath hasn't slowed, Then let the darkness wrap you like the cloak of someone who was once worthy, not because of what they gave, but because of what they kept. You've walked far enough tonight. Let the floorboards hold the rest. And if you're still awake, was it a little easier this time?